All right, can everybody hear me? I happen to be a criminal lawyer. That's what I do for a living. I know an awful lot about how the criminal law in domestic violence impacts on people who are charged with domestic violence. After all, that's what I do. But I was counsel for a men's group called FACT, Fathers Are Capable Too, and as a result of that, attended as counsel at the Hadley inquest. And boy, was that an eye-opener for what's really going on in the community, at least based on what I saw. And one of the things that constantly recurred as the evidence came forward in the Hadley inquest was references to community groups. There were the bureaucrats, there were the academics, and there were the lawyers, and there were the community groups. And as I sat there day after day over a period, I guess, of about 6 or 7 weeks of evidence, it became clear to me that when they were talking about community groups, they were talking about funded groups. Groups where somebody was being paid to put the thing together, paid to organize events, paid for publicity, paid, and with money at their disposal to carry out whatever their particular agenda happened to be. And maybe that's the first point I want to make here. The groups you are dealing with here are people who are not funded by anyone. They are primarily, although not exclusively, made up of men who are paying support and are involved in these groups because they care and because they believe, and there's no money funding these groups. The community groups you will encounter here. If I'm wrong, someone will correct me, but I believe everyone here is from a self-funding group of dedicated people. And they really, in any kind of open contest, don't stand a chance against a heavily funded government-subsidized group. Well, now, why is the government subsidizing these groups? We put the Attorney General into the cabinet, and now the Attorney General is just another politician. And if you look at governments, you know that there are two levels in government. There's the permanent government, which is the bureaucracy, and there's the temporary government, which is the elected party of the day, and they may be there for the Attorney General may be there for 18 months or 2 years or 4 years if we're lucky. Well, we still believe, though, that the Attorney General should be independent of any kind of overt political considerations in running the courts. That changed drastically, almost without anybody noticing, in 1986, when Ian Scott was the Attorney General and also Minister of Women's Issues. And now the bureaucracy that administered the court started to take on a secondary approach to things. Well, that proceeded through the Liberal government of that time, and then we got the NDP, and well, we know what their position on these things is. We had Howard Hampton as Attorney General and Minister of Women's Issues, and then we had Marion Boyd, who was not a lawyer, administering the courts, and she was also Minister of Women's Issues. And I'm saying, and you can dispute it with me if you like, I'm saying that since that time, the bureaucrats in the Ministry of the Attorney General have bought into and have become identified with the shelter movement. That's my distinction. I'm saying that what's going on here has absolutely nothing to do with feminism and everything to do with the shelter movement, which began in around 1980 when we got our first shelters, and the workers in those shelters started to see things that were awful and unpleasant. There's no denying that that's what happened. But they got this kind of, and this should be an interesting phrase for the police, they got this tunnel vision. And they started to believe that what they saw in their shelters was going on throughout the community. So that when a woman appeared, having been assaulted, and nobody's denying that those things took place, and nobody's denying that they don't take place today, but when a woman appeared having been assaulted, and they filled a shelter with women that were assaulted, the workers themselves came to believe that this was just representative. This wasn't the few women who were assaulted, but this was representative of all women in Canada. And this movement imperceptibly, slowly grew through the 80s. And of course, in Ontario, we had the development of the Attorney General's office with Marion Boyd, who had bought into this completely. So I'm saying now that on these issues, the Office of the Attorney General is completely committed to the shelter movement and to the notion that all men are violent, all men are bad, all women are benign, all women are good. And an awful lot of money flows out of the Ministry of the Attorney General to fund the so-called community groups who are dedicated to that proposition. Let me tell you one thing that you may not know about what happens when a guy is charged with domestic violence. The vast bulk of guys going through the system, I'm sure the officers here would agree with me, are guys who've never had trouble with anyone before in their life. They tend to be hardworking guys without a criminal record who are somehow involved in their families, deeply involved in their families. It's Thursday night, there's some altercation, maybe he hits her, maybe he doesn't, maybe she hits him first, maybe it's just raised voices. I understand there's been a decline in women making reports. Very often it's the children or the neighbors now making the report. He gets arrested, he's released in the morning on condition not to have contact with his wife or children. The wife may be frantic. The in-laws are coming, there's a mortgage payment due, he's got to get to work, she's got to get to work, somebody has to look after the kids. The whole rhythm of the family is now completely distorted. After his bail hearing, where he's usually represented by duty counsel, and his release on consent with the condition, he ends up in my office. I do the history, I discuss the whole matter with him, and I say to him, you know what? I think you've got a defense here. Maybe it's self-defense, maybe it's mistake, maybe it's accident, maybe it's any one of a number of things. You've got a defense here. Now, let me just take this away from me for a second. And so he says to the lawyer, how long will it take? Well, depending on the court building, it could be up to 6 or 8 months. Well, what's going to happen to me in those 6 or 8 months? Well, you're going to be on bail. Well, can't you get the bail varied? No. Very, very little chance of getting the bail varied. Well, she'll come and talk to you, and she'll tell you she wants the bail varied. I said, that's not going to help. I'm not talking to her. Well, she'll talk to the police. Well, that's not going to help. Well, she'll talk to the Crown. That's not going to help. So you're on bail for 6 months. You can't have contact with her and maybe even with your kids. So he says, all right, how much is this going to cost? And depending on the lawyer, it's anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. So he says, now wait a second. I may not have done anything wrong, or I didn't do anything wrong. But for me to fight this, I've got to spend 6, 8 months out of contact with my wife and maybe my children. They're living in the house. I'm paying all the bills. I'm working. I'm living somewhere else. I've got to pay in this other place. I'm going to miss Christmas. I'm going to miss the kids' birthdays, whatever. And you want $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. I don't know if I like this very much. Well, he heads to court for his first appearance, and he hears the speech. If you take the PARS course, the Partner Assault something or other course, pay the government $400 or $450 or whatever it counts, 6 or 8 or 10 weeks, depending on the jurisdiction, you can go home. And then you plead guilty, you get a conditional discharge, and then we'll vary your bail and you can go home. And after you've completed the course, you can get an absolute discharge. How much does this cost? Nothing. Well, maybe I'm not guilty, but gee, you know, very hard to resist. And this is a way that all of our law that we've developed since Magna Carta, the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, the gathering of evidence, the presentation of evidence, is all gone. And they generate a high number and a high level of statistics proving men are bad, men are violent, women are good, women are benign.